How's it going, y'all? In this video we're going to be talking about the Panasonic G9. Is it worth it? Let's get into it. We've seen all the samples, we've seen the big release information around the G9. What everyone is ignoring, in my opinion, is that it's using the exact same sensor as in the GH5. Some people are already responding well to that, but I don't think it's a very good thing at all. I think it's actually kind of a bad thing. On the sensor level, it's not realistically offering any improvements. Panasonic's saying this is a photography-oriented GH5. GH5 then becomes a video-centric camera, but the GH5 is still a very capable stills camera. So what the G9 is then is a GH5 without the video capability. But that's not right. The G9 can shoot 4K 60, 1080p 180. So it would seem that the G9 is actually a GH5 whose primary limitation is that it can't shoot anamorphic 6K and is also $300 cheaper. No matter. Surely it's not quite as good across the board as the GH5. What? Are you sure? So it turns out that the JPEG color and rendition is supposed to be much more nuanced and improved over the GH5. The IS 2.0, 6.5 stops. The AF and DFD performance is supposed to be substantially improved over the GH5. That 6.5 stops of stabilization, by the way, 1.5 more than the GH5, which is impressive given that the increase we're seeing from the A7 II to the A7 III series of cameras does not seem to be that big. The OLED viewfinder is supposed to be superb. From what I've seen so far, the color rendition out of these JPEGs is actually really lovely. It's, you know, when I saw the samples from the RX10 Mark IV for the first time, I was blown away. I very genuinely was like, it doesn't matter that this has a 1-inch sensor because the colors are just on point. And to an extent, I felt very similarly about the G9 when I saw those samples. But the noise reduction software, the noise reduction algorithms, although they're supposed to be much better, still, to me, have a lot of issues. While they can capture and render organic textures like skin much more easily and much better, you know, I already have a hard time figuring out where the focus is supposed to be on a Micro Four Thirds sensor camera, and with the noise reduction that we're seeing, nothing was in focus. So you lose every ounce of detail that you might have otherwise had, but your images are less noisy. So is that really improving your high ISO performance, or is it just glossing over all of it? In my opinion, I'd rather have the detail. So surely you're watching this saying, well, does he have a grasp on what the G9 is good for? And maybe you're also asking yourself, well, what is the G9 aimed at being? Maybe you're also asking, how in the world is it $1,700 instead of the $2,000 that the GH5 is, despite offering very similar and oftentimes better options and feature sets than the GH5? Some of those features that are arguably better: 20 FPS with AFC, 80 megapixel multi-shot mode, up to 60 FPS without AF or AE. Woo! Here you're probably expecting me to start reverting to the dinosaur, the full-frame loving dinosaur that I am. You're probably expecting me to be really biased against the G9 because it's a Micro Four Thirds sensor camera. That'll get no one anywhere. Everybody seemed to have already drawn their lines, and I can definitely appreciate the value proposition of a Micro Four Thirds sensor camera without wanting to use one regularly. Let me tell you what I'm struggling with the G9, and that is the 20 FPS. It's not just the G9, but the 20 FPS mode. Supposedly the AFC can keep up with that fairly well, which is surprising given it's a contrast-based system. More frames per second does not equate to a more professional camera. More FPS does not equate to a better stills photography camera. More FPS is not like more dynamic range, where you can say, I don't need it, who cares, but it will make the camera better. FPS is the cheapo way of making you feel like your camera is better than it is. More FPS is the cheapo way of making you feel like your camera is more professional than it is. Sure, what Panasonic's done is very impressive in terms of the hardware, being able to push all that data through there. And apparently the buffer is incredibly deep, which is even more impressive. But more FPS past a certain point, what's the point? What it seems like we're doing nowadays is judging the professionalism of imaging solutions, of interchangeable lens cameras, based on how many frames per second it can shoot. It's ridiculous. I understand that photojournalists will need high FPS. I understand that some event photographers will need high FPS. I understand that sports photographers, wildlife, birders will need high FPS. But professionals also need better dynamic range. They need better high ISO performance. They need supreme reliability with their AF systems. And you know what? As good as Panasonic's contrast detect-based autofocus system and their DFD that's layered over top of that, the depth from defocus, it's still contrast-based. Personally, I would never trust a contrast-based system as much as I would a phase detect system. Maybe I just need to use it for a week, the G9. Maybe I just need to use the G9 for a week to, cure me of that. But I've had contrast-based systems fail on me when phase detect systems didn't. But you know why the G9 is a professional camera? Regardless of poor high ISO performance, regardless of dynamic range, it looks like it came from 2011, regardless of the fact that the G9 with an f1.2 prime doesn't really offer any size, weight, or cost benefits over APS-C or full frame option, where one can get much better objective performance out of the sensor on every front with AF lenses that are capable, with AF lenses that are at f1.2 and f1.4 that are very capable. The G9 is a professional camera because the body. It's a solid magnesium weather sealed body. It's tough. It's a professional camera because the IS 2.0 is good for 6.5 stops. It's a professional camera because of the hybrid functionality, the very strong hybrid functionality, paired with nuanced colors and refined noise reduction in the JPEG. The system of Micro Four Thirds is very strong and very deep, which is respectable and commendable, even if it's not going to be preferable for full frame loving dinosaurs like myself. But I can't help but come back to what the G9 is good for. Ostensibly, it's good for everything. It can shoot 4K 60, it can shoot 1080p 180, it can shoot 20 frames per second with autofocus. The 4K is at reasonable bit rates. It's at 8-bit, so it's not, a degraded 4K bit depth. It's a reasonable common bit depth. It's just not 10-bit. The JPEG engine is refined. But I still can't help but think, why? The G9 is a Micro Four Thirds sensor camera. Duh. It's made by Panasonic. But it's the size of a mid-size, like a pro-size APS-C DSLR or a full-size, full-frame, mirrorless interchangeable lens camera. The lenses aren't that small, especially the fast primes or the big zooms. Those faster primes, the f1.2s, they're huge and heavy, and they cost full-frame lens kind of money. Those full-frame lenses would be faster with shallower depth of field and more total light gathered. I guess what my problem is what is the G9 and the GH5 both are changing what the value proposition of the Micro Four Thirds sensor format is supposed to be. So what is it? I think the G9 looks like a great camera. I think the GH5 looks like a great camera. I think that between these two devices, Panasonic has won me over. I would look at a Micro Four Thirds sensor camera before immediately dismissing it, as opposed to previously when I would have not even considered it in the first place. Their brand equity is very strong. What they're doing with their devices is incredible. These are remarkable devices in a lot of ways. What's the value proposition of Micro Four Thirds? Micro Four Thirds started out as small body, small sensor, small lens, small total package. Small packages that are very capable even still. The thing is that the G9 shows a shift by Panasonic towards larger body cameras in their higher end devices. And that's kind of weird to me because they're trying to compete with devices that are cheaper with larger sensors that arguably offer better image quality because you can capture more light, be it, a very high-end APS-C camera or an entry-level full-frame camera. And the Panasonic offerings in the G9 and the GH5, but here the G9, they're offering premium price points above, in fact, entry-level full-frame options like the A7 and the A7 II. They're even more expensive than very high-end APS-C options like the Alpha 6500 and the Fuji X-T2. So I guess the question is, can the feature sets of these devices from Panasonic of a G9 really make up for the size that you're not actually winning on compared to APS-C and full frame mirrorless interchangeable lens options? Can the feature set make up for less sensor capacity? Can the feature set make up for the physics-based optical limitations that a smaller sensor is going to have? Can the feature set make up for the weight that you're losing on by going with the Panasonic G9 by comparison to a 63-6500 or a Fuji system, or even, you know, a Sony full frame system with light primes like they offer for the FE mount? I guess to bring this all back in, right? The G9 is trying to offer a value proposition that's in line with very high performance and capacity APS-C and entry-level full-frame systems, and I don't think that it does. Not because I think that the feature set is inadequate, not because I think that the sensor size is inadequate objectively, but because I think that the physics of dealing with those smaller sensors is presently inadequate. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that by definition APS-C and full-frame are better. I don't think that's the case. I'd rather everybody had a dedicated interchangeable lens camera in their hand rather than a smartphone, even if that meant 1-inch size sensors or micro four thirds sensors or whatever that isn't what my particular piece of cake is, you know? What I am saying is that the G9 doesn't seem worth the money to me because Panasonic haven't used the time between the development of the GH5 and its release and when they started development of the G9 and now its release to improve the sensor. They haven't used that time to increase the capacity and to improve the performance of the sensor. They're not pushing micro four thirds format sensors forward. They're pushing feature sets forward, but not the capacity and capability of the sensors. In my opinion, they absolutely need to address the raw sensor performance in order to effectively compete with the price brackets that they're trying to find themselves in, with $1,700, $2,000 cameras. I understand with the GH5 that they can price it that way and it's okay because it's a video camera, but if you're going to make a stills-oriented camera, it's got to be able to line up fairly well with dynamic range, with ISO performance. Frames per second over a certain point just doesn't make up for it. And with, you know, your 80 megapixel 8-shot multi-shot mode, like, that's great, but that's not something that you can use run and gun. Panasonic is trying to compete with sensor sizes that aren't having to worry about the physics of light-based limitations that they are because of their smaller sensors. And they're not trying to improve those sensors that we're seeing so far. I think it would have been very easy for them to say, you know what, we're going to make this BSI and just radically improve performance across the board. So it's a big shame to me that they didn't do that, and that would have really knocked the level up, but I don't think that the G9 is going to compete with the A9, with the D5, with the 1DX2. I don't think micro four thirds systems are going to compete with larger sensor devices for most people. I don't think they're offering any longer the size improvements, the size factor, the form factor that's more amenable to picking it up and going and traveling with it if they're going to focus on making these really high performance devices like the G9 and the GH5. So I feel like the micro four thirds identity is kind of coming into question here. And I'm very interested in knowing what your perspective is on that. So thank you very much for your time and for your attention. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe, check out the Amazon affiliate links. I will get a fee. Won't change the price. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.